It is tempting to consider the violence that occurred against Armenians more than a century ago as a purely historical issue that has no bearing on the present. This is certainly what the current Armenian political leadership, as well as its partisan scholars in the Republic and the diaspora, would like Armenians to believe. The truth, on the contrary, is that past violence is just as relevant today as it was more than a century ago, and those who ignore that fact or actively pretend otherwise, in fact, invite the final stage of the destruction of Armenians as a viable people. The violence of 1915 to 1923 has never been addressed by the perpetrators. Even factoring out 1894, 96, and 1909, and restricting consideration to the genocidal process of 1915 to 23, including the conquest and liquidation of the 1918 Armenian Republic, that destruction did immense harm, including the dramatic reduction of the population through direct and indirect killing, imposition of conditions that caused suicide, and forced assimilation of children and women. Trauma that reduced the productivity of individuals as well as the birth rate even further. The expropriation of virtually all Armenian material resources, from major businesses to kitchen pots and pans. The extraction of a substantial amount of labor that served Turkish interests and was lost to Armenians. The prevention of the substantial amount of material, resource, cultural, and other production that would have occurred through the efforts of those who were killed or traumatized into unproductivity by the genocide. The weakening of Armenian familial structures, community, and identity through forced dispersion of survivors, and the expending of the great effort necessary to maintain these in the very difficult conditions caused by the genocide. The loss of the allied Assyrian and Greek Christian communities that, prior to the genocide with Armenians, formed at least 20% of the Ottoman population, strengthening each. The reduction of geopolitical relevance, status, and power, coupled with Turkey's substantial gain in relevance, status, and power, and the consolidation of Turkish and now Azeri identity, even as Armenian identity is forever in question, weakening, and vulnerable. The result is a global population of perhaps 8 million Armenians, with many of these feeling little tied to their identity, instead of a regionally significant state with a population of 25 million or more, a weak, landlocked, isolated state facing enemies with 30 times their numbers and immense wealth generated based in significant part on the resources originally expropriated through those who are now facing these enemies. What is more, the success of 1915 has only served to embolden Turkish eliminationist anti-Armenianism and driven its spread to Azerbaijan. The present Turkish state, society, culture, educational system, and military were formed through the genocidal destruction of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. Because Turkish society never went through even a minimal and surface rehabilitative process, the genocidal anti-Armenianism that drove 1915 and was increased through the execution of that genocide became embedded in the very culture, social relations, and institutions of the Turkish Republic. The attempted and now completed destruction of Armenian Artsakh was both caused by and resulted in such an embedding in the Azeri state. Turkish participation in the destruction of Artsakh was explicitly driven by Erdogan's stated intent to complete the genocide of 1915, a project that Aliyev expressed Azeri national commitment to in very clear and blatant terms. Genocidal anti-Armenianism, far from fading over time as 1915 retreats into the past, has festered and grown and spread within each society to the point where it was activated in full fury again in 2020. Today, this militarily, politically, and economically powerful anti-Armenianism has targeted for final destruction a small, vulnerable residual of Armenian people whose continued existence is a perpetual question. Just as a rehabilitative process in Turkey should have replaced genocidal anti-Armenianism with a positive attitude toward Armenians and a sense of profound obligation to the well-being of Armenians, the failure to address the effects of the demographic, material, and political weakening of the global Armenian community means that Armenians have little power relative to the force of today's genocidal aggression by Azerbaijan and Turkey. Yet, they do have some power, including the world community's conscience, opposition movements in Turkey and even Azerbaijan, and the impressive level to which Armenians themselves have worked for more than a century to at least partially overcome the destructive force of multiple genocides. What is more, many Armenians have thankfully left behind the naivete and desperate hopelessness that prevented Armenians from recognizing the full implications of the steps in the evolving process the Committee of Union and Progress followed more than a century ago. For them, there is no illusion today that any apparently benevolent actions by Turkey and Azerbaijan toward Armenians simply mask a deep and abiding genocidal anti-Armenianism and a renewed active pursuit of the destruction of the Armenian people. An Armenian government that attempts to delude Armenians in the Republic and around the world about this basic reality is not merely an obstacle to the future of Armenians, but an active support of the genocidal process being pursued against them. As for most other groups subjected to genocide, in 1915 Armenians had their traitors and collaborators who chose promises, often lies, of individual benefit in exchange for sacrifice of their people as a whole. That the current Armenian leadership has chosen to join these shameful Armenians of the past in a process that only very naive and foolish people cannot recognize as already having weakened Armenians yet more is simply put inexcusable. That it is likely to be reelected is itself evidence of how much the legacy of genocide and the power that Turkey and Azerbaijan have gained over Armenians has reached into the very interior of Armenian politics and society, to the point at which too many Armenians have internalized into their culture and social relations the logic of their own destruction. Ignore the past and the way that it completely structures the present and threatens the future at your peril, Armenians. You already have more than a century of horrific experiences that show you what doing so will lead to.